Had a lot on my plate last week, kids. I had a couple of big gigs to prep for. Had a couple of things also going on the side. Didn't have a lot of time to go deep on a topic, so I put out the call for questions so we could do a Q&A episode. And as ever, the John Huff Podcast community obliged. So we're going to talk about tennis. We're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of podcasting. We're going to talk about bass players. We're going to talk about Fleetwood Mac. It's going to be a lot of fun. And we're going to get to it on the other side. Hello, you're listening to the John Huff Podcast. Oh, yay. I titled this episode after one of the most famous John McEnroe on-court rants of all time. The question, jerk! This is the Stockholm Open, I think it was. I want to say 1984. McEnroe is the top-ranked player in the world, and as always, Johnny Mac is having a go at the chair umpire about probably a litany of perceived incompetencies. Johnny Mac is my favorite tennis player of all time. All right, here's my big three. Johnny Mac, Andre Agassi, Roger Federer, okay? The classic serve and volleyer, and the baseliner, and then this artiste who could just do all of it better than everyone, you know? That was Federer. Johnny Mac was must-see TV. Back in the day, 70s, 80s, Johnny Mac was must-see TV because of this just explosive on-court demeanor, you know? But what was underneath all of that? The blow-ups, this sort of combustible personality that Johnny Mac is most famous for, is one of the great players of all time, you know? And you may look at my list, my little pantheon, which is Johnny Mac and Agassi and Federer, and you might think those are not compatible personalities. They don't belong together, and it seems strange that one person would have all three of those in their kind of top three positions. It's weird, but when you look at it, there's a really compelling character through line. Now, McEnroe was the original enfant terrible of tennis back in the 80s, right? The combustible personality, the yelling at people. You go watch the footage from The Question, Jerk! You go watch the footage of that, and he demonstrates a remarkably competent two-handed backhand. When he goes to his chair and he starts just smashing cups and swinging and knocking stuff onto the court and people are booing and whatever. Johnny Mac was not a two-handed backhander kind of guy. But man, he could have done it. You watch him launch some of those cups across the court in his fit of rage at the chair umpire. Johnny Mac was the enfant terrible. He was the bad boy of tennis. And then in the early 90s, as Johnny began to fade from the top of the game, a new enfant terrible came along, and that was Monsieur Agassi, okay? Remember Agassi back in the early days with the long hair and the mullet, which we later found out was a wig, and the attitude is everything, and the Kodak commercials, and the Brooke Shields, and is he going to wear white at Wimbledon or not? Is he going to buck tradition, this maverick Agassi with all of his hair and his wild persona? You know, Agassi took on the mantle, and as a player, he had that two-handed backhand. Agassi was a stand on the baseline and absolutely grind you into powder with those ground strokes, man. That was Agassi's game. But the funny thing is, even though that early initial Agassi, with the long hair and the mullet and the wig and the whole thing, even though he won Wimbledon 1992, rose to the top of the game, thing is, that Agassi hated tennis. Oh, that's right, kids. That Agassi hated tennis. He had been forced by a semi-psychotic father to play tennis all of his life, and he did not like it. He did not enjoy it. He did not want to play tennis, but he was good at it, and his father forced him to be that in Vegas, you know? Didn't want to be that, was forced against his will to be a tennis player. Turned out he had the aptitude and the physical gifts to be one of the great tennis players of all time, but he didn't like it. And so he reached this level where he won Wimbledon, and he's getting by on his natural gifts, but his heart isn't in it, you know? And he's doing the flashy clothes, and he's doing the Kodak commercials and whatever. And there's Agassi beside his other, you know, the other great American player at the time was Pete Sampras, who was very straight, you know, very businesslike, and Pete won most of the stuff. I mean, Pete's an icon too. So Agassi, the initial Agassi, is the bad boy of tennis. He is the maverick of tennis. He is the outlier. And he wins Wimbledon, and he's one of the greats, you know, he's one of the top players in the world. And then the bottom just falls out. Mid-90s, the Agassi thing was over, and he dropped out of the game. He disappeared for a couple years. His ranking dropped from the top down to like the mid-100s, like 140, something like that. Agassi was gone, man. And it seemed as though Agassi was over. But what was happening in the background is that Agassi was getting his stuff together. Now, he recognized that he hated tennis. He didn't want to be part of tennis as he had been part of it. But as he was away, he began to discover a sense of purpose, okay? And he started charitable stuff, and he started really working with kids in particular, underprivileged, less fortunate kids. And eventually he started a charter school, and it became his purpose to serve and support underprivileged kids in Vegas and then eventually beyond. And he found this sense of passion for living, which translated into a passion for the game, because the game was a way to draw attention to and to bring funding to some of the charitable work that he wanted to do. He found a purpose beyond tennis. And if you were around, you know what happened. One day, after being gone for a long time in the late 90s, Andre Agassi reappeared. And he walked out on the court with his head shaved. And the attitude is everything thing was gone. I think maybe even the Brooke Shields thing was gone at that point. And Andre Agassi added to his extraordinary physical gifts this intense emotional sense of purpose in the game. He went on a run after that of 4, 5, 6 years at the very, very top. Won a bunch of majors, was the number one player in the world. His tennis was driven by a much deeper sense of purpose, and he became kind of the classy guy on tour. And then he handed that mantle, when his time was done, to this new kid from Switzerland called Roger Federer. And so you have this through line. You have this evolution from Johnny Mac the bad boy to Agassi the bad boy to Agassi disappearing and reappearing as this purposeful, humble, driven, charismatic player on the tour who reaches number one. And then that mantle goes to Federer, who is the very definition of class and sportsmanship on the court. It's an interesting through line, man. And if you have not read Andre Agassi's autobiography called Open, it is one that you've got to read. It is in my top 3. It might even be the top. It might even be, for me, the most affecting piece of nonfiction that I've ever read. I pick that up. I go into the bookstore now and I pick it up, and I just can't. They have to drag me away because it's such a compelling story and so beautifully written. Because it was written with J.R. Moehringer, all right? Moehringer, however you say it. J.R. Moehringer is one of the great and gifted writers of our time. He wrote The Tender Bar, and there's now a film adaptation of that, his own biography. And he wrote this with Agassi, and it's just so beautifully written and so compellingly written. And it's such an amazing story of triumph, of reinvention, of finding a purpose. That is opened by Andre Agassi and is a book you got to read. I'm recommending it for the John Huff Podcast Book Club. Opened by Andre Agassi is the first selection, okay? Funny thing about Agassi is that he is married to the great Steffi Graf. And Steffi is my favorite female tennis player of all time. For the moment, all right? Traditionally, it's Steffi. Bianca Andreescu has a chance to overtake Steffi, maybe, being Canadian and being dynamite. But these Canadian players who appear and seem poised for greatness seem to hit a peak, and then injuries just happen. Like Jeannie Bouchard played in a Wimbledon final. It looked like she was on the up, and then she just fell off the radar entirely. Started doing commercials, started being recognized more for being beautiful than for being a tennis player. And Jeannie's never been the same since. And then Milos Raonic came along, and he was, in the top 10, in the top 5. It looked like Milos, 6'5", big serve. Seemed like Milos was poised to win a major or 2 or 3. And injuries to his foot, injuries to whatever. And then Bianca comes along and finally breaks through and wins the US Open a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago. And it looks like Bianca is poised for greatness, which she may still be. And injuries. What is it about Canadian tennis players and being on the cusp of legend and then having foot problems and injuries and hammies and then falling off the radar again? It's frustrating. But I'm pulling for you, Bianca, because I think you've got it. But until then, Steffi Graf is my favorite female tennis player, and I was at one point in time able to be in the presence of Steffi Graf. And I got to tell you, kids, presence is the operative word. Now, I used to go with semi-regularity to the professional tournament in Toronto, York University, wonderful tennis complex there, and I would go fairly regularly, go down, take in a day of the action, and one year, the women were playing in Toronto, the men were in Montreal, so we went down to see the women playing in Toronto, and a highlight of the evening program that day was an early round match featuring Steffi Graf, okay? Now, you go to one of these tournaments, and the players are just walking around. It's a really great, at York, I assume it's similar everywhere. There's not just center court. There's 2 or 3 other courts with seating, and then there are side courts where you can just go stand at a chain link fence, and you can just watch people playing. A lot of the early round doubles stuff will be happening out on the outer courts, and you're 20 feet away. And if you've never watched professional tennis players, even the guy or girl who's ranked 98th in the world or 117th, if you've never watched that from 20 feet away, you're missing something, kids, because my goodness, can those people hit a ball and place a ball and such delicate touch and power, You watch it on TV and it's like, that's pretty cool. You watch it from 20 feet and away, you're like, wowzers. Everybody who's in the top, 1 or 2 or 3 percentile of anything in the world is incredible. So it is with these players. And, they're kind of amongst you. One day, my wife was nearly flattened by Sandrine Testu, who was walking to get to her match somewhere and just bulldozing everybody, But the bigger players, your Steffi Grafs, who at the time is the dominant player in the world. Incidentally, the very same day, Steffi's great rival to that crown, Monica Seles, returned from the stabbing. Remember the on-court stabbing that stopped Monica in her tracks? And she made her return that night. I got a 2-for-1 deal. I got the return of Monica Seles, and I got to be in the presence of Steffi Graf. So in those days, I don't know if it's still the same. There was like a building where the players would gather, and then they would walk to center court, and they would rope off an area for security, especially after the Seles incident. They were pretty sensitive about that sort of thing. So they would rope off an area, but you could gather around and kind of watch the players come through. So I leave my spot at center court, up in the nosebleeds, and I comes around to see if I can get a look at Steffi, okay? And there's people gathered. Man, there are people gathered. There is a crowd gathered. You'd think the queen was going by, and in a certain sense, she was the queen of tennis. And so everybody's gathered, and I sort of elbowed my way in, got a vantage point. Everybody's waiting, and then a ripple goes through the crowd, and she's coming. And then all of a sudden, Steffi Graf is just walking past you. And it's presence, man. She's like 6'8", blonde hair, she's got the bag over her shoulder, and then this just aura. This just aura washes over you, and it's Steffi Graf, and you're like, even walking to the court, so much elegance, so much athleticism. You can just tell that this person is possessed of such extraordinary physical gifts. Oh, man. And you know what? I think she might have lost, actually. I don't remember exactly, but just having her walk past you was like, wowzers. Some people just have a presence, man, and Steffi Graf is one of those. And of course, she figures very prominently in Agassi's book because she's married to Agassi, all right? And I don't know why I'm starting with tennis, except to say, the question, jerk, is Johnny Mac. And I love Johnny Mac, and you can't have Wimbledon without him. Listening to his commentary at Wimbledon, it's just part of the game, man. The court getting ripped up over the course of 2 weeks, and Johnny Mac giving you the commentary. It's question day, all right? Had a lot going on the past week I couldn't dig in too deep. And I got some really fun questions, all right? We're going to just jump right into it because I've already taken a lot of time. The first question comes to us, and it always warms my cockles when it does, from the great Monty Colvin himself. Insert crowd applause here. I always get just this weird little thrill. And Monty and I have been friends for like 20 years now. Time is going by. But it still freaks me out just a little when I get a notification that says Monty Colvin liked something, or Monty Colvin commented on something, or I get a message that pops up from Monty Colvin. Because Monty, of course, best known as the bass player and occasional singer and chief songwriter for Galactic Cowboys, who are one of my favorite bands of all freaking time, okay? And I've said it before, but if you had told 17 or 18-year-old me back in the early 90s that one day I'd be having casual conversations and getting comments from Monty Colvin, the dude with all the red hair and Galactic Cowboys, would have freaked me out, man. It's like, there's no way that's possible. But that's the internet age, kids. Monty and I are good friends. We have gotten to know each other pretty well digitally over the years, and we have met in person too. Maybe talk about that in a little bit. Monty says, hey, how do you make a podcast? And that is a cheeky question, of course, because Monty has been in the podcast game longer than almost everybody. Believe Monty's Rockcast has been on the air for about 14 years and just celebrated episode number 250, all right? Monty's been faithfully releasing new episodes, once a month or thereabout for 14 freaking years, man. So if anybody knows how to make a podcast, it's Monty. And if you're into the hard rock and metal and you want to hear fun road stories from a guy who toured at a level way, way beyond me, tune into Monty's Rockcast. You can get it on your Apple. I think that's the only place you can get it. I think you can only get it on Apple. Monty's Rockcast is a lot of fun. Monty produces a great show. He always has. And he's right to ask me, how do you make a podcast? And I think that's tongue-in-cheek, but I'm going to answer it anyways, okay? Because some of you out there, this applies to any sort of artistic endeavor or any sort of project, And I think there are two sort of perspectives from which we can approach this. There is the technical perspective. How do you actually do it? And there's the conceptual perspective. How do you actually do it, right? So from a technical perspective, how do you make a podcast? Well, the thing is, podcasts, at least traditionally, are auditory, so the game is to capture audio, right? What's the technique of that? You need a microphone, and you need something to record that microphone into. That's the nuts and bolts, all right? Does not have to be sophisticated. I use, on this program, a Shure SM58 microphone. A lot of you out there are musicians. You've got 1 or 2 or 10 of these in your house because the Shure SM58 is the go-to vocal microphone for live performances everywhere. Anytime you've gone to a show, whether it was a stadium or a little club, chances are the singer was singing into a 58, okay? Because they are built like a freaking tank. You can drive a tank over a 58 and then plug it in and that sucker will still work, all right? It is the vocal mic of choice. And as I'm a singing drummer and musician, I have a couple of these. So when I started making the podcast, I thought, you know what? Why not just use the 58, all right? Now, if you want to, you can make a podcast just talking into your phone, all right? It does not have to be sophisticated, but better audio creates a better product, all right? You want to present with a certain level of professionalism, okay? I find that a 58 works great. There are now a plethora of different microphone choices out there in all sorts of different categories, whatever. You don't have to lose your mind thinking about this, okay? Anything beyond your computer speaker is a good start. You know, that computer mic. The industry standard in a broadcast booth tends to be the Shure SM7B, but you're talking about 4 or 5 times the price of a 58. Don't really need that, and to use a microphone like that, you need a very well-treated room, okay? That will pick up a lot of background noise. It might create some editing headaches, especially if your room, like mine, is not that great. I got a lot of bare walls. I got a lot of echoey stuff going on. SM7B might create a problem there. If you've got a beautifully acoustically treated studio, terrific, but you don't need it. You don't need to blow your brains out buying a really expensive microphone, okay? Especially in the beginning. SM58 cost you $100, $120, whatever. Works perfectly well, and you can take it on your live gigs. And in the early days, I was doing interviews, all right? So I would record into a Zoom H4n Pro recording device, okay? Very handy little unit, doesn't take up a lot of space, records really, really well, and has 2 inputs. Very important. So I could plug my 58 into channel 1, I could plug my guest's 58 into channel 2, and record on separate audio tracks, all right? And what you got to do is when you capture your audio, it needs to be edited, all right? It helps to do some editing. And I use a freeware digital audio workshop, or DAW, or DAW, called Audacity. I'm sure all you guys out there and girls, whatever you identify as, have heard of Audacity. Okay, it's great for home recording. Pretty sophisticated little program. Not super difficult, so somebody with my very, very poor level of technical expertise can use it. And I record initially into the Zoom 2 channels, take out the card, pop it in via USB card reader, download to my computer, pull it up into Audacity, do the editing, all right? Now, I don't do the interviews so much anymore, and I had to figure out one of the things that stopped me doing the podcast initially. One of the reasons it took me so long to actually begin to produce it was that I didn't know how to record reliably telephone audio. It's not really telephone. I didn't know how to record an interview over the internet with somebody. You can do that a lot better now. COVID brought us Zoom. Zoom makes it pretty easy. Zencaster makes it pretty easy. The tech exists now that didn't even really exist that much when I started a few years ago. That's come a long, long, long way. But I had to figure out how to do it. So I figured out that you could run a 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch cable from my computer back into the Zoom. So I got me in channel 1. I got the computer in channel 2. Record via Skype. I would get reasonably good audio, provided my guest was wearing headphones. Otherwise, you get this loop of my voice going out their speaker and back into mine. It's just created havoc. Get your guest wearing headphones, and if they have a microphone, so much the better. That was difficult. I had to figure that out, but I did eventually. And so with the interviews, I'm recording 2 separate channels via my Zoom H4n. Worked fine, all right? You can go back and hear the audio. I've gotten a lot better at editing, but the audio from the beginning was reasonably good. Now, I don't do so many interviews. I go directly from my Shure SM58 into a little unit called a Shure XU. 2XU? XU2? A Shure, let me look at it. A Shure X2U, which is kind of a, by this point, old school digital interface, all right? Your 58 has an XLR attachment. It does not go into your computer. Your computer has a USB port. So what the X2U does is it attaches your XLR microphone to a USB cable so that I can now record directly into Audacity, which is what I'm doing right now. X2U, also not an expensive device. It's a bit old now, but it works fine. I am looking at changing my recording setup. I got a little mixer here that I'm going to experiment with whenever I get some time. And I'm looking at a more modern digital interface. But to get started, you don't need to do that. All right, you can record into a Zoom. You can get a cheap X2U unit and plug directly in and start recording into Audacity, okay? Or if you're a Mac person, into GarageBand. You can use the free software and it works great. You don't have to get sophisticated. It does not have to be difficult. Pop filter helps, just saying. But here's the thing. You get it recorded, you pull it into your DAW, you edit it, you get it ready, cut out some bits, fix the audio, drop your intro in, etc. How do you get it from your computer out into the world? And here's where things have changed substantially since I think Monty started the Rockcast. Because back in the day, like 2008, you kind of had to do this manually. I think you could upload to SoundCloud, and that would be distributable that way, whatever. But now you've got so many platforms. You've got so many places where you can put your show. To do that manually for each one would be an enormous amount of work and a real pain. Fortunately, the podcast industry has caught up with what we're all trying to do, and you now have distribution services, okay? And there's a bunch of them, and they all offer fundamentally the same thing in perhaps different ways. When I started my show, I went with one of the first ones that came out, the kind of the granddaddy of podcast distribution, which is Liberated Syndication, better known as Libsyn. So what happens is I have an account with Libsyn. One of the reasons I started my Patreon was to help me start to cover some of the costs associated with producing this thing. My hosting and distribution via Libsyn is one of those costs, all right? So I pay a fee every month, and when I get my episode done, packaged up and converted to an MP3 file, I upload it to Libsyn, and it distributes it for me. I say publish, and it goes to YouTube and Spotify and Apple and Stitcher and Google and on and on and on and on. And you can set this up within Libsyn. It's very, very easy to do. And I don't think Monty does that. I think he still goes direct to Apple. All right, which is fine. But now you have these distribution services that will do it for you. It's all very slick, kids, you know. Record it, edit it, package it, upload it to your distribution service, and off it goes. And that's how you make, technically speaking, a podcast, all right? Not that difficult. I did have help along the way. YouTube is your friend, obviously. Learn a lot from YouTube, kids. But, you know, in my case, particularly in the early days, having a bit of trouble capturing really good audio. Because I didn't know what I was doing, because I ain't an audio engineer, okay? So I had help from our old friend Denny Goche, who is an audio engineer. Denny helped me figure out how to capture better, how to edit. And our old friend Seamus Evilly, who was an early guest on this, formerly the host of the Drumeo Gab podcast, which was a very, very slick production. Seamus was great, but he had to figure it out too. But by the time I came along, he had it figured out. And so people like Seamus and Denny helped me, and I owe to them a debt of digital audio gratitude. But what about the conceptual side? This is the thing. All right, you can have the technical nuts and bolts together, but what on earth is your show going to be? That's a very personal thing. I started off doing interviews because That's what I'd always done. I was a music blogger. I interviewed people. As a freelance writer. Professionally speaking, interviews are what I did. And so when I started the show, I took a look at Marin and I took a look at Rogan, and I thought, I'm going to do interviews, man, because that's what I do. And the first 30 or so episodes are that. And I wanted to do interviews with people who were doing unconventional things. You know, my purpose in those days was to show people in my audience that it was possible, because I needed to believe it was possible. At the time, I was working real hard to be a full-time musician. It's a struggle. Any of you who are out there trying to do that, or anything in the arts, particularly, COVID, post-COVID, you know how tough that is. And so I wanted the evidence for myself and for others in my audience to say, look, here's the inspirations. Here are the musicians that are doing it. Here are academics. Here's a poet, whatever. Here are the people that are doing the stuff that they say you can't do. It's the proof. It's the evidence. And so that was the initial impetus. It started with Phoenix Fire. Phoenix Fire, who has multiple Guinness World Records for letting people staple things to him and doing all sorts of heinous stuff in a fire breather. And he gave us not just the story of that, but his fabulous, really profound and moving life story. It was really great. If you haven't listened to episode 1, go and do, because Phoenix Fire is an incredible inspiration. I don't like to go back and listen because the audio on my show has come so far, but that's where I started, all right? Doing interviews. And then about halfway through, 30 episodes, whatever, I was like, you know what? I modeled this show after Marin, and I modeled it after Rogan. I don't listen to those shows. Those are not the shows that I listen to, at least not faithfully. I'll listen to Marin if he's got a guest who interests me, whatever. But my favorite part of Marin's show is when Marin's just talking, the intro. Some people hate that. Those are the parts I like. So it is with Lewis Black's Rantcast. I don't actually listen to the rants. I listen to the 15 minutes of Lewis talking. And I realized that the shows I like are monologues. I like Jim Fortin and I like Monty. Monty's never had a guest in 250 episodes. People have sent in stuff, myself included, but it's just Monty talking. And I'm a person who likes to listen to one person talking, I like lectures. I'll go listen to Chris Hedges. Now I'll listen to Blind Boy, of course, a great inspiration for my show. And so at a certain point, I began this transition into doing monologue episodes. And by the way, I lost a lot of listeners who wanted to hear interviews, and that's totally fine. But I wanted, over time, increasingly, to do monologues because that's what I like. That's what I listen to. That's where my heart is. And so I picked up new listeners, It's just the way it goes. What do you make your show about? Well, that's the thing. That's the point of this section. It's that it's an evolution, okay? The way you make a podcast is you make a podcast. When I interviewed Denny way back in the early days of the show, I like, Denny, how have you made this life as a full-time musician? And he says, well, you do it. You do it. You don't overthink it. You just begin. You know what I mean? And over time, things evolve. So if you look at my early solo episodes, the delivery is much different now than it was then. It's become more comfortable. It's taken on a personality. And the content is much different. I started listening to Blind Boy. I started getting interested in doing more topical, more in-depth episodes. This is all an evolution. And everything you do is an evolution. So you may not even know 100% what you want to do with a podcast, but you can sit there for 10 years not knowing what you want to do with a podcast instead of beginning and over the course of 6 months having things evolve and drop into what you want to do. Sometimes you can't discover what it is until you start doing. Take a step and the path will appear. You know what I mean? So I can't speak for conceptually how you make a podcast beyond my own story. My advice is to begin. Figure out the tech as much as you can, and then begin. And a funny thing will happen. As you keep moving forward, the show will evolve. What you're doing will evolve. And if you have a sense of purpose and how you want to do it now, great, more power to you. Off you go. But if you're stuck on that, you wanna, just begin, all right? And podcast is a great way to meet your heroes, kids. As is a blog, I found myself on the phone with Doug Pinnick from King's X for an hour, or Tom Kiefer from Cinderella for half an hour, or in the early episodes of this show, sitting down with Jason Tate, maybe my favorite drummer ever, for an hour. These things open doors, and it's a lot of fun, man. It's a lot of work. Hell of a lot of work, man, but a lot of fun. My advice is to begin. If you want to paint, begin. If you want to write, begin. Do not sit with your head thinking about it. Do some prep. Okay, that's totally fine. But do not be held back by uncertainty about conceptually how. Begin. Begin and let it unfold, okay? Because you may find yourself suddenly recording episode 102, having had no concept when you began over coffee with Phoenix Fire, who doesn't drink coffee, that 102 episodes later, here you are with an utterly different program, but one that is more aligned and more natural to you and feels better and is more inspired. Not that the early episodes weren't inspired, but things evolve into what they actually want to be, but they can't if you don't begin. And that was way longer than I wanted to take on Monty's question. Go listen to Monty's Rockcast. Go listen to Galactic Cowboys. Go listen to Monty's solo stuff under the Crunchy moniker. Fabulous freaking stuff deserves to be heard, okay? I got a bunch of really great questions from our old pal Corey. Corey of Collective Evolution, great friend and supporter of the show. I will take some of them. I can't answer everybody's questions. I will bank some of them for future episodes, okay? Really appreciate Corey. He's been such a supporter and such an encourager. Man, thank you. I'm going to try a couple of your questions, okay? He sent in a bunch of really good ones. One of which he sent in was, can you tell us about your first or a memorable concert experience? This is not me playing a concert. This is me attending a concert, all right? And since we're talking about Monty, why not continue on that particular through line, all right? I have only seen Galactic Cowboys once in my life, and I did not catch them on kind of the big touring heyday that they had in the 90s. They had like 10 solid years of putting out records. The first two on Geffen, they are both fabulous. All the records are fabulous. I didn't get to see them in the 90s because it was the 90s and I just didn't know. I don't know how often they were in Toronto or in the area. I know they were, but I don't know how much. I missed them. I never got to see them, and I love their records. They're probably a top 3 band of all time for me. Love Galactic Cowboys. Heavy. Especially the first couple of albums were this bizarre mix of thrashy riffs and Beatles harmonies. Really, really terrific. Just different kinds of stuff than you've heard before, but super, super. Loved them immediately, still do. Never got to see them. And so back in 2013, Galactic Cowboys popped up and said, we're doing a reunion show. Everybody ought to come. We're doing it in Houston, which is where the band was based in the heyday. And so my wife and I said, we're going, because you never know how many chances you're going to get. So we flew down to Houston in 2013 to catch Galactic Cowboys playing at a little club there. And it was packed out, man. Doug from King's X was there. Got to say hi. And earlier in the day, there was a meeting of fans of Monty's Rockcast where I got to hang out with Monty face to face for the first time and the last time so far. It'll happen again. And that was a terrific day and wonderful. And then we all gathered at the show that night. It was the original lineup of Galactic Cowboys playing together for the first time in a very long time. And you ever just walk into a show and feel the energy? Just feel that energy. It was in the room that night, my friends. And so there were a couple of openers, whatever, great, had a good time. And then it was time, and everybody filled in around the stage, and the lights drop. And Galactic Cowboys come out, and everybody's so freaking stoked. They're one of those cult bands where people who love them really love them, man. And they had come from all over the world to see this reunion, myself included, man. Took a long flight to be there. And they came out, and they opened the show with Space in Your Face, which is the title track from their second record, okay? Space in Your Face. And the opening song, the title track, is mostly an instrumental, okay? Galactic Cowboys had this quirky style. I mean, a lot of it pounded, the harmonies are amazing, but then they would do goofy stuff too. Every record, maybe had some goofy stuff on it. And Space in Your Face is a goofy song. So it's got this crazy riff and they're wailing out. And then it sort of builds up to this moment and everybody screams, "Space in your face," right? It's goofy and it is a perfect representation of Galactic Cowboys. So they start playing the song and everybody recognizes what they're playing. And everybody goes nuts. They're playing Space in Your Face. And then it comes up to the first moment of the gang vocal. Dun, 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 and the whole place at the top of our lungs. Space in your face! And it was transcendent. Sometimes you just have a transcendent moment, which is a collective experience. And that whole club packed out with Galactic Cowboy fans celebrating the band that they love so much, together with the band just screaming Space in Your Face. And I'm getting tingles now. 9 years later, the hair's standing up on the back of my neck, just remembering the collective joy and release of that moment. The whole audience screaming Space in Your Face. That was a shared experience, and you can't manufacture that, man. You cannot manufacture that. So, Corey, one of my great memorable concert experiences was shouting Space in Your Face with a bunch of Galactic Cowboys fans, And then I think, of course, of the first time I saw King's X live after so many years. So many years of missing it or not knowing or whatever. Finally saw them in Toronto in the early 2000s. And I have been a super fan since like 88, And this was like 14 years later. They come out and it's like, there they are. And it's like, wow, that was amazing. I'll remember forever. They played 3 hours. My friend who was with me had to sit down. It's like, Johnny, I can't stand up anymore. This is like, I can't. They played for 3 hours. It's incredible. I had a couple of really great concert moments recently that I talked about when I went and saw Sarah Harmer twice recently. And the first show was in Burlington and she just came out solo, just her and her guitar. And there was an energy in the room that night too, because she hadn't toured for years. And COVID had shut everything down, and then we were gathered together finally. And she came out with just her and her guitar. And she opened with my favorite Sarah Harmer song, which is Tether. And I never thought I would hear her play Tether live. It just didn't seem like the sort of song she would play live. And then she comes out, and there's just this moment of everyone seeing her again. And we're together again. There was this great catharsis in it. And then she started to play Tether. And I just fell apart, kind of. I got a little bit misty. That moment was transcendent. It's another one you can't manufacture. She played my favorite song that I never thought I would hear her play in those circumstances, in that moment, and so quietly and beautifully. And it just broke me a little bit. And then a couple weeks later, as I talked about, when she and the band played The Lookout. The Lookout is the song that is representative for me of all I went through with the anxiety, with the COVID, and how I kept myself sane just playing The Lookout, trying to learn the odd time parts. I learned her whole new record, which is amazing. I've talked about this. And when she played that in London, and it just sort of came back to me, how hard that was and how far I've come, how far so many people have come, Hearing her play that made me misty again. Music has an ability that nothing else has to invoke memory and create memory and just inspire emotion. And whether it's this joyous rapture of shouting Space in Your Face or hearing one of your favorite artists perform a song that has meant so much to you personally, it can be happy, it can be sad, it can be angry. Music has the ability to invoke emotion like nothing else does. And there, Corey, for you, are some highlights of concert experiences for me. Write in and tell me, everybody. I want to know about your transcendent concert experiences. Because I know you've all had them. You're all music fans. Talk to me a little bit. about some of the great concert moments you've experienced. How on earth did we get to like 45 minutes already? I've got so many more questions. We're obviously going to have to do a part 2. Woo! But right now, for your listening pleasure, I will do the Patreon plug. As you know, I did launch a Patreon site recently for the show, patreon.com/JohnHuffPodcast, where, if you are so inclined, for the low price of $5 a month, you can support the show, all right? Think of it as a $1.25 tip, less than the price of a cup of coffee, for every episode that I put out to just help me offset some of my costs, man, because they do accumulate when you're doing like this, as I've talked about before. Patreon is 100% voluntary, as opposed to ad reads that you are forced to listen to, or in my case, fast forward through. I always skip them. I always skip them. They are intrusive. They bother me. I don't like them. I don't want to do them. Patreon makes it so if you are inclined to support the show, you can do so. It's a low fee. Keeps me in the game a little bit. And you don't have to hear me reading about all the stuff you've read about 8 million times on all the other podcasts, you know? I like Patreon for that reason. If you are inclined to support me, thank you so much for doing so. I do appreciate it. And if you're not, that's totally fine too. The show will remain free wherever you enjoy fine podcasts. Don't want to do Patreon, but you want to help? Share these episodes, ratings and reviews. Folks, ratings and reviews make a big difference. Please take a second, drop me a rating, drop me a review on your favorite podcast platform, preferably a positive one. It will help the show get noticed, and I do appreciate it. That is the end of the Patreon plug, patreon.com/JohnHuffPodcast, and I do appreciate your support. Had a series of interesting questions from our old pal James V. James V, longtime supporter of the show, and I do appreciate that. Thank you, man. James V is a bass player and a good one. Now, he wrote to me to say that as a bass player, there are certain drummers that he is really drawn to. They include Stewart Copeland, Mark Brzezicki of Big Country. Turns out James V's a big country fan, and so he enjoyed the last episode, Pop Goes the Podcast, which had a lot to do with Big Country. And if you're interested in 80s pop music that you'd be surprised to know I really like, go back and listen to that episode because it was a lot of fun. Got a lot of really great feedback from folks about that one, which I was delighted to experience. Thank you. Go listen to Pop Goes the Podcast. Talked about all the 80s music, a lot of it, that isn't metal, that I liked that might surprise you. James V, really into the Big Country. That's cool. So Mark Brzezicki is one of his drummer guys. And Carter Beauford of the Dave Matthews Band. Really interesting because Stewart Copeland of the Police and Carter Beauford are both, incredible, top of the game, fabulous players both, but both really busy players. You listen to Carter Beauford play a lot of that jam band stuff with Dave Matthews. Giant drum kit. It's like toms for days. And a lot of like cymbals and a lot of sound effect kind of cymbals, whatever. And he uses all of it, man. Carter Beauford is an amazing and extremely creative player. Very, very busy. Not my bag at all. And then Stewart Copeland with the Police is legendary. The way he pulled punk influences and reggae influences. Stewart Copeland is a master of the hi-hat cymbal. The way that dude plays hi-hats, very innovative, very cool. These are not my style of player. Much as I appreciate and wish I could play like any of them, I can't. Not really my bag, but certainly absolutely respect what those cats have done and can do. But with respect to that, James V says, what about you with bass players? Are there bass players that jump out to you as a drummer? And I had to think about that one. Had to think about it because I haven't paid a whole lot of attention, but actually there are. In particular, right now, the bass player that I'm really hot on is Dave Hartley from the War on Drugs. All right? Everybody knows I love the War on Drugs, and everybody knows I love Charlie Hall, the drummer for the War on Drugs, because that cat is a major inspiration to me for the simplicity with which he plays. because that's how I play, and that's how I like to play. And sometimes you need a cat playing at the highest level that way to make it okay for you. It creates an allowing, you know? Ringo did that. Charlie Watts did that. Charlie Hall from the War on Drugs does that. And another of James V's favorite drummers, Mick Fleetwood, does that. And I need all those cats. I need all those cats to remind me that it's okay. I don't have to feel pressured to play like a Carter Beauford when I can't and I don't really aspire to. It's not my bag, man. It's not my jam. Dave Hartley from the War on Drugs, I noticed right away, because the cat is just smooth as freaking silk, you know? That's a big band, and I mean, there's a lot of people in it. There's a lot of people on stage. And Dave Hartley is just a very unassuming player. You know, he stands where he stands, doesn't move a lot, and again, what he plays is butter. It's just butter. And if you listen, I heard his bass playing before I paid much attention to him, because on A Deeper Understanding, the record from 2017, which is kind of the first War on Drugs record that I really contemplated, that I really listened to, that hooked me, you just listen to some of the bass lines. Go listen to the song Pain. Pain is probably still my favorite War on Drugs song. It's a lot of fans' favorite War on Drugs songs. And just listen to the runs he's playing, you know? They're very subtle. They're very musical, very melodic. They are hooks. He is one of those guys who has the ability to play the bass guitar, but play hooks. You know, sometimes you go to a Rush show and you're air drumming the drum parts. Well, if you're paying attention, you can air bass Dave Hartley's bass parts because they are so melodic and so wonderfully executed. And there's another song that is largely overlooked. It's kind of a deep cut from A Deeper Understanding. It's called Clean Living. I don't think they ever play it live. Clean Living, it's the 9th track on A Deeper Understanding. And there is such a subtle bass hook in that song. And I can't really demo it for you here, but it's one of the first things, apart from Pain and the bass playing on that song, that jumped out to me right away. This tune has this really great bass hook in it, in the choruses. And you'll hear it if you listen. And I hear it every time, and I think that is brilliant. I don't know if Dave Hartley came up with it, or if Adam Grandiseel had it in mind when he wrote the song, or who came up with it. I hope it was Dave. And you hear it. When you hear it, you hear it. And you just stop. It stopped me in my tracks. And I'm like, I had two thoughts. The first thought was, that is brilliant. And the second thought was, I'm going to start playing bass guitar. No other bass player has made me want to play bass guitar. Dave Hartley makes me want to play bass guitar. And then you watch live footage of the band, and you just watch him, and he and bass are one. He does not do anything showy physically, but watching him work the fretboard, it is second nature. He's one of these cats who is beyond in terms of aptitude. Obviously, there's a ton of practice involved over the years and tons of playing, but you can tell that the music comes through him. He just knows what to do. I reckon he doesn't even have to think about it. It just happens, you know? Dave Hartley from the War on Drugs, such a subtle, smooth, elegant, simple, but so tasteful and melodic bass player. And the other guy that came immediately to mind was Scott Shifflet from the California punk band Face to Face. Now, I've talked about Face to Face a lot on this show, and so much of their song, so much of their sound, which is utterly different from the War on Drugs. The War on Drugs is an alternative rock band, an art rock band, you know? Face to Face is a straight up, in your face, California punk band, and their signature is speed. Face to Face plays them fast and loud, and that is driven so much by Scott Shifflet's bass playing. And he can play just fast. Again, one of the signatures of Face to Face is that it's really melodic. One of the signatures of a lot of punk music is that it's really sing-along, catchy, melodic, especially that California stuff that started in the 90s. And that's Green Day, and that's Face to Face. And so their songs are really hooky, really melodic, and so much of that is driven by Scott Shifflet's ability to play a galloping bass, to play fast, and to play these really amazing runs. Fast, man. He's fabulous. But also, there's so much melody in it too, you know? And those bass parts are incredible. And what I didn't know, a couple things about Scott Shifflet that I didn't know until I started following on Instagram, is that in addition to being just a fabulous bass player, dude is a ripping lead guitar player. I had no idea about that. So you go into his channel and he does a lot of like playthroughs and play-alongs, and here I am just messing about. And you see him playing bass and you're like, yeah, it's Scott Shifflet. He's crushing it on that bass. And then all of a sudden there'll be a video of him playing guitar and he's playing a Van Halen song and he's playing Eddie note for note, or he's just ripping a solo or whatever. And it's like, what? Come on, man. You're going to be the bass player you are. And then, by the way, I'm probably a better guitar player than anybody who's ever been in Face to Face too. He's just one of these guys. And his brother, of course, is Chris Shifflet of the Foo Fighters, also a guitar player. So that's a heck of a musical family right there. But it's interesting how much bass guitar is the foundation for so many of these great songs. And then what a player like Shifflet or a player like Dave Hartley can do to bring another level, you know, to just add this flourish to a song. And without getting in the way, that's the other thing. It's like if you've got all this technical ability, you can really get in the way with that stuff. You know what I mean? A guy like Shifflet could be playing all over everything. Doesn't. He picks his spots like a pro, man. Picks his spots like a pro. Dave Hartley picks his spots like a pro. So much of the rhythm section of that band, Charlie Hall and Dave Hartley, is all foundation. It's foundation for Adam Grandaciel's voice. It's foundation for all of the atmospheric guitar work that Adam Grandaciel does. That's the stuff that you immediately notice in the War on Drugs. But you realize that that stuff works because Charlie and Dave are providing that foundation and they are picking their spots, you know? So it is with Face to Face. It's driven by the bass, but you don't even really notice it until suddenly Scott Shifflet's in your face with a run and you go, wait a minute, should be watching that guy, you know? Bass players, it's interesting. They talk about the relationship between the bass player and the drummer and the band. I have experienced that. Ken the Zen and I have played together so much. We just did on the weekend with Danny Goche and had a great time. You know, you develop that rapport, you develop that relationship. It was interesting. Kay Howell and I, on the last Sarah Smith tour, Kay was ostensibly playing bass on her keytar, which was fun, and she did it great. But you have to build that connection, you know? It's important that you listen to each other. James V asked me about drum and bass combinations. He mentioned John McVie and Mick Fleetwood, which I so appreciate because, again, people like me need Mick Fleetwood, and I love Fleetwood Mac. Freaking love Fleetwood Mac. And the more I listen to Fleetwood Mac, the more I love Fleetwood Mac. But I made a great sin. I made a grave error and a punishable sin much earlier in life when I kind of thought that Fleetwood Mac was just, you know, Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. That's Fleetwood Mac. And I overlooked utterly Christine McVie. Christine McVie, I don't know, man, living in the shadow of Stevie Nicks for so long, I wonder if that got to her. Maybe it did. I mean, that band is notoriously dysfunctional. Let's be honest. When you talk about dysfunctional rock bands, Fleetwood Mac is first on the freaking list, man. I don't know if Christine McVie felt overshadowed by or was upset about being overshadowed by Stevie Nicks, but she is the shite, man. And Christine McVie wrote my favorite Fleetwood Mac song. Now, Fleetwood Mac has a list of hits that still get played on the radio as long as your arm. Fleetwood Mac has written at least one of everybody's favorite songs. My favorite Fleetwood Mac song, much as I love Rhiannon or Go Your Own Way or Gypsy or any of that stuff, my favorite Fleetwood Mac song is As Long As You Follow, which was written by Christine McVie. And she's the underrated player in that band, man. I overlooked it I dismissed her. And then I realized, wait a minute, As Long As You Follow is my favorite Fleetwood Mac song, and that's her, man. And newfound respect for Christine McVie. And the drum and bass combo with John McVie and Mick Fleetwood, fabulous, man. And I have been in combinations, Ken and I, others, where you just begin to feed off of each other. You listen to each other. It's so important to stay together, to lock in, you know, get your kick drum going with whatever. Thing is, that relationship ideally probably needs to exist outside of the stage as well. Interesting, right? I think drummer and bass player need to get to know each other on a personal level too. I think it genuinely helps. It helps with all the band members, you know? But if there's a sense among the rhythm section that you're in it together, that really, really helps. And I think that bond is kind of formed perhaps off stage in a lot of cases. It's interesting. It's a dynamic that I haven't thought too much about, but I've recognized it in retrospect, you know? So Dave Hartley, Scott Shifflet, bass players that I really noticed. And then, you know, you have to mention Monty again with the monster bass rig, and Doug Pinnick for tone, for straight up tone. You know, in Doug's case and in Monty's case, it's just one guitar in both of those bands. The bass playing and the bass tone has to fill up a lot of space. And both of those guys have really extraordinary and unique tones. You know, it's not a surprise. Monty and Doug have been friends for a long time, so maybe they feed off each other. I don't know. Did you get Doug playing a 12-string bass? Take up a lot of space with that, man. They need a crane to bring it out and put it in his hands, you know? Monty has that too. Really interesting, big, thick, fuzzy tone. And I notice bass players who bring tone like that, you know? And I don't know how they do it. I am not equipped to speak that language. I can't tell you how they accomplish that tone. Monty has talked about it. Doug has talked about it. So I recognize people who bring tone as well as style. You know, I like me some tones, man, even if I can't explain exactly what they are or how they're accomplished. So listen to Galactic Cowboys records. Listen to, obviously, King's X records. But go check out some early Face to Face. The self-titled record is great. Big Choice is great. Their newer stuff, too. And definitely listen to A Deeper Understanding by The War on Drugs. Listen to Dave Hartley's bass playing. Listen to their new record, I Don't Live Here Anymore. Listen to the bass lines, man. And then go online and watch some footage of these people. Watch the subtlety of the technique. Watch how they fit in the band. You watch a Galactic Cowboy show, it's a big metal show. Tons of energy. Monty brings that energy. You know, he's jumping up and down. He's going crazy. He's wearing his freaking sneakers. That's a big rock show, and he presents his playing in that way. Go watch a War on Drugs show, which is art rock, much more subtle, you know, not a spectacle in the sense of a metal show. Different sort of performance, and watch how Dave Hartley fits into that performance. It's very, very interesting. You know, how the playing and the presentation can sometimes go together. They kind of feed each other. Just an observation. I'm also observing that we're over an hour here, and I have so many more questions. So we're going to do a part 2 of this Q&A thing. I don't know if it'll be next week. It depends on how this week goes, I guess. Thank you so much to everyone for sending in the questions. If I didn't get to your question, chances are pretty good I'm about to get to them in a subsequent episode. Keep sending in questions. I'll bank them. There are going to be weeks where I just don't have the time or bandwidth or wherewithal to go deep on a particular subject. These questions are a lot of fun to answer and think about. They take me in directions, which is cool. So keep sending them in. I so appreciate the feedback I got on the last episode. I genuinely appreciate hearing from you that you liked an episode or something interested you, or you had a memory twigged or a thought twigged that you shared with me. I appreciate knowing that you're listening, and I appreciate your feedback. And send me questions. You know, if there's stuff in this episode that came to mind for you, send it to me. We'll talk about it, you know. This is a give and take relationship. I appreciate you listening. Find me on the Instagram at JW_Huff. Find me when I'm not in Facebook jail, which I have been a lot lately for reasons I can't explain and don't know. And not surprisingly, Facebook won't tell me. the John Huff Podcast on Facebook. I am now, hold on to your hats, kids. I am now on freaking TikTok, John Huff Podcast, because. So if you're a TikTok person, you can find me over there. Please do give me a follow. You know, it all helps, man. It all helps. Please share these episodes. Please do give me a rating and review. Remember, good things happen when you put yourself out there. Thank you so much again. Gonna shutting up. Get to some more questions very, very soon. Hope you're having a great week. And hey, I'll check you later. Yeah. Space is